verse 2, he says, I know your deeds and your toil and your perseverance, and that you cannot tolerate evil men, and you put to the test those who call themselves apostles, and they are not, and you found them to be false. And so Jesus begins with giving some very uplifting news to this church at Ephesus. They're doing some things right. And so these are the things that they are doing right. He says, your deeds and your toil. That's your labor. And the word here means labor that you could actually become weary from. It's hard work. It's not just, I'm kind of involved in what's going on at the church. No, it's you are heavily involved in the work of the church. That's what's being meant, and he commends them. I know that you are heavily involved in working for the church. And he says in verse 3 that you have endured for my name's sake, right? You're working for me, for my name. And so he recognizes that they are hard workers, this church at Ephesus. They put their backs into it, literally, probably, and spiritually. He says, I know your deeds, your toil, and your perseverance. This word perseverance is actually two Greek words made up into one, hupo and meno. Hupo means under, meno means to remain. And so literally the word means to remain underneath. And so the imagery that's given is that you are remaining underneath some weight, right? Something heavy, that you're supporting what's going on and you stay there and you stick it out, right? That's called endurance, right? That's called perseverance, like the word is translated here. That you, even when times are tough, you stick it out. You stay underneath that weight. You don't give up. It's a beautiful picture of what the church ought to be doing, because guess what? The church is under a great weight in our country. We have great responsibility, like we talked in Sunday school this morning, right? We as Christians have responsibility, and we bear a great weight upon us, a weight to proclaim the good news, to share the love of Christ, and also to persevere, to stay underneath that weight. I know your deeds and your toil and perseverance, and that you cannot tolerate evil men. Obviously, the church at Ephesus, that word tolerate can mean bear with. And so the idea is that they were passionate about purity, right? They did not tolerate evil men. And so it wasn't that they just allowed sin to be in their church. It wasn't that they just allowed themselves to fall into temptation over and over. They were working hard and working diligently to not tolerate those things, to not bear with those, to not involve themselves with people who were in constant sin, who were in what we would call sinful actions or behaviors. And so this church obviously was a pure church. They believed in purity. They believed in doing the right thing. And that's something that's difficult for a church, difficult for a church to be about purity, because we don't want to offend people. We don't want to drive people away from the church. And so sometimes we don't push purity very much. And yet the Bible has so much to say about purity, about sinlessness, about being like Christ, about pursuing those things, pursuing holiness. And so as a church, the church at Ephesus here, they were about holiness. They encouraged one another to do the right thing, to stay away from the temptation that may come their way. And so Jesus says, I know your deeds and your toil. I see your perseverance, and I see that you are passionate about purity. And finally, I see that you put to the test those who call themselves apostles and yet are not. And you found them to be false. Right? So in this time in the early church, there were a lot of people claiming to be apostles. There were a lot of people claiming to have the truth, claiming to speak and be a representative for God. And yet churches had to do the diligence of finding out if they were doctrinally sound. Guess what? We still do that today. Doctrine is important. We're studying the doctrines of Christianity, and we've talked about several times in Sunday school how if you don't believe the right things, then you can get really messed up in your belief about God. If you don't study the scriptures, if you're not certain about what is being taught in the church, then there can be some serious problems and consequences. And thankfully, this church at Ephesus, they stood for doctrinal truth. They stood for doctrinal purity. They wanted to make sure that those teaching in the church, those giving any type of exhortation or encouragement knew the doctrines, knew the faith, knew who Jesus was, knew that it was salvation by grace through faith, knew these things that the apostles had been teaching, and they were commended by Christ. He says, I know that you put to the test those who call themselves apostles, and you found them to be false. You did your due diligence. And so this is a very encouraging opening statement to this church at Ephesus. They are hardworking. They persevere. They don't tolerate evil. They are passionate about purity, and they have good, solid doctrine. That sounds like a church I want to go to, right? That sounds like a church that is doing the right thing. And yet, Jesus says that you have perseverance, you've endured for my sake, and have not grown weary, but